Ready to go. Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I am here with futurist philosopher, social singularity, and provocateur, Max Borders. Welcome, Max.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm really excited about today's conversation. Max and I have been dancing around Alexander Bard's intellectual deep web and other places and talking about a wide variety of different things. Consciousness came up and we're circling into that. So welcome, Max. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
As am I. Thank you very much. It's such a beautiful perennial conversation, and it just doesn't seem to die. And one can be filled with lots of contradictory sentiments and can convince oneself of a position one day and have it flip the next. And
Totally.
I tend to be that person. And so it helps me maintain a consistent fascination with the subject.
It's a beautiful and unbelievably fascinating subject, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to share. So what's going to happen today, rather than me interviewing Max about all of his brilliant insights and work, we're going to be talking about the concept of consciousness. I'll invite you, Max, to give us a little background, just where you're coming from. You mentioned the turn of the century. I think you were really interested in it. It faded a little. This circled back. And then this gives us an opportunity to then dialogue about the concept, what UTOK says, what are mysteries, where we have agreements, disagreements, and then just see where that takes us from there.
Sounds good.
Lovely. So how about we start there with just tell us a little bit about, you mentioned that a while ago, 20 years ago or whatever, this was a topic that fascinated you. You circled away from it for a little bit. Can you give us a little background about kind of where you were at that time and then where you are now? And then we'll get into our conversation that way.
I think, yeah, the best I can say in a nutshell, so as not to bore the listener, is that it was one of my focus areas in graduate school,
Okay.
The philosophy of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's some adjacencies to the philosophy of mind. You have neuroscience, you have cognitive science, you have psychology, and you have aesthetics and phenomenology. Once you get back into philosophy as a discipline, you have phenomenology, and of course, you have metaphysics. Now, the particular branch of analytic, which is Anglo-American philosophy that I was pursuing at the University of London, was metaphysics. So the philosophy of mind was considered a subset of metaphysics.
Okay.
And
Gotcha.
my investigations took me into, in particular, as a subset of the philosophy of mind, in particular under the questions of phenomenal consciousness. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important to unpack. There are different kinds of consciousness.
Definitely.
And some mapping these kinds of consciousness can be, and of course they interact in interesting ways, or so it would seem. For me, it's easier, and it may be inappropriate, but it's easier for me in the metaphysical sense to drill down to phenomenal consciousness.
I think I'd be tracking that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what do we mean by phenomenal consciousness? Your listeners may not be aware. Phenomenal consciousness is the idea of the experience of something, what has been called the what it is like qualities of experience. It's basically everything that you experience in your waking life, from the time you get up to the time you fall asleep at night, and sometimes intermittently when you experience dreams. Okay? These particular, we might call them modalities, but experientially, it might be redness, okay? Or your experience is behaving redly, if you like the adverbial form, or painfulness. Now, of course, this branch of metaphysics is going alongside in terms of its study with stuff you're familiar with, certainly, which is a branch of psychology, behaviorism. Okay. Yep. So you'll see a lot of tracking of the sort of behaviorism of the past, which treated the mind, and indeed genes, I would argue, genetic dispositions, what's inside the black box as such, a black box. And
Yep.
it really just looked at behavior. So you get the operant conditioning, you get all that good stuff, and you're way more familiar with that stuff than I am. But the idea is we're looking at inputs and outputs.
Yep.
The problem with this is it tended to treat human beings rather like tropistic creatures, right? Like a plant that moves towards sunlight.
Yep, just very reflexive,
It's very reflexive.
You know.
And I think there's a degree to which we need to honor that tradition because in some sense, we are still tropistic creatures in a manner of speaking. But we do have this experiential, phenomenological part of our existence that is almost entirely our waking existence, right? So when we apply the scientific perspective and language, we're really doing something very different.
Totally.
Okay. And you and I agree very much on this.
Very much so.
You and I very much agree on the idea that we are in now, other people might try to tear us down on this, but I want us to identify a point of overlap in our worldviews. We are both what one might call monists or naturalists. Okay. That is to say, there is a single universe, even if it's a multiverse in some bizarre sense of multiple dimensions and things like that, there is a unity to existence that doesn't permit us to divide the world between the supernatural and the natural.
Right. Totally.
So we are talking about one existence, one ontology, a single ontology, but we have to talk about, study, observe different dimensions of that ontology in different ways.
Lovely.
I think we pretty much agree on that.
100%. Yeah. Also, I'll make a comment about that just from a UTOK perspective. So UTOK, I frame it as an endo-naturalistic worldview. What I mean by that is there's it's not a foundationalist worldview saying, oh, I know fundamentally what truth is and I've revealed truth. It situates in a scientific epistemology whereby the one natural world's the one that makes sense. A dual world system is very difficult to make sense of metaphysically. So I'm skeptical of that. And I want to get clear on naturalism. Like, what is the scientific natural worldview and how can it make sense? Partly, I argue, actually, this whole issue of mind and consciousness is something that it struggles to make sense with as a whole. But we're going to look from UTOK vantage point, we're going to look inside, assume one world naturalism, and try to make sense out of the world from that basic vantage point.
Excellent, excellent. And from what I've been able to investigate in your vast body of literature that you've created, you have done yeoman's work, really in both positioning disciplines that track the various emergence vectors through time. Okay, so not only how we have emerged as a species and the kinds of mental processes that we're able to undertake, but wider from that, all life through time, all the way back to the core of existence, even in areas like subphysics. Okay. And that is tremendously useful when we have that mapping, because it allows us to disqualify certain kinds of things that if you were to invert or get something out of order, it precludes our making certain kinds of metaphysical claims, assuming that we agree with the metaphysical commitments of your epistemology and ontology, or ontoepistemology.
Exactly.
That is,
and so that's basically the tree. UTOK's tree of knowledge system is our descriptive metaphysics to understand scientific epistemology, how it evolves in culture as a certain kind of justification system that then maps the ontology, energy, information. I would say energy, information, input, order into the matter object, life organism, mind animal, and culture person planes. All UTOK listeners, regular UTOK listeners, will be familiar with that. So.
Yeah, and I am familiar with that too. Those four basic categories. And what's interesting is when you drill down into those, let's say, I may be beating up the metaphor here, but then you can find more branches of the tree.
Totally.
So, for example,
that's exactly right.
if we want to talk about human beings as a certain type of animal that has a certain kind of emergence vector in time, this certain kind of animal with this emergence vector in time, specific kind of animal, which is distinct from other animals that share this, share maybe a branch of the tree, but we have a specific sub-branch or calving aspect to us that gives us certain kinds of capabilities.
Exactly.
And you divide these into one way you divide it is with sharing overlaps, at least the way I understand it, with John Vervaeke,
Totally.
whether that's relevance realization, understanding qualitative states in terms of their ability, for example, in very rudimentary ways, pain and pleasure, to give us an interface that allows us to navigate the world in a certain way.
Good.
No problem with that. Sounds great. Sounds like really solid cognitive science. It distinguishes us also from tropistic animals that we were talking about earlier, where behaviorism would not. And it gives us, and it also gives us parallel track of your four minds, three minds distinction, and then those three minds, some of them have subsets.
Exactly.
So mind one has A and B. We're talking specifically, at least I'm talking specifically today, drilling down in what you call mind two, which
100%.
are qualitative states.
Exactly. Lovely. Yep, 100%. So, just I will say that because people may be a little less familiar, but many will be. So, the mind-animal dimension emerges around the Cambrian explosion. What you get is the basic animal body plan. You get a complex active body with a segmented body with a brain running around doing 3D behavioral things. I pulled that from Michael Levin. He and I have been talking a little bit. So 3D behavior is what we do with the neuromuscular structure that plants really don't do as animals. We don't know, we can talk about this, when the experience of being, that subjective phenomenological consciousness comes online. I would say it has to be within a brain. If it's outside of a brain, there are a hell of a lot of questions that really raise. We got a lot of neurocognitive correlates that's where it is. It's the experience of what it is like to be. That we're going to call mind two. That's going to emerge out of mind 1A, the neurocognitive processes within the brain. And I will also say, really, in many ways, is also going to the larger mindedness in mind 1B, which is the whole sensory motor loop of the animal and the agent arena relation. So we delineate this in the book, A New Synthesis. So you're right on target. And then that grows, there's a stack of recursion, then we get propositional language, and what you and I then are syncing up on is mind three, the domain of mind three, which is talking justification, which affords a self-conscious recursivity that seems to be a little different than other animals, but we can talk about that. But there we go. I think
that's what allows you, and at least in some sense, to give rise to aspects of language and culture, for example.
Totally, right? Exactly. Mind three is basically capturing, because the descriptive metaphysics of the tree of knowledge says that novel information processing, communication networks is key. So propositional speech is a different kind of information processing. That we look to what the structural function of that. We say it's justification in UTOK, and then it grows, explodes in two directions. Well, one is the cultural dimension of justification, and our collective intelligence affords technology, and that's a whole nother layer. And together that gives rise to human society, these justifications and technologies on top of our primate being.
And there are so many different continued calving sets of questions in the culture layer, in the technology, in these, what happens after mind three, right? More aspects of bifurcation of the tree that are so fascinating and endless that we could talk about.
Totally.
However, we're going to pull back, think, mind two, that I would say sounds perfectly plausible to me that this emerged in the Cambrian explosion. What we may quibble about until we resolve the apparently verbal disagreement is whether and to what extent this has to be brain instantiated with brains.
Good. Okay. Yep.
And the reason I would say that is not that I think we actually disagree in a fundamental way. The reason I would say that it's merely a quibble is that if we were to talk about it in causal physical terms, which is the to my mind, relevant part of naturalism, We can imagine a future technology that instantiated to a very high degree, to a perfect degree, the causal physical processes without being, say, carbon-based.
Yep.
Without being, it's still a product of that evolutionary iteration cycles from the past, which you're, I think, exactly right. Would you talk about an emergence of qualitative states of this form? I think it's absolutely bang on that this is a product of evolution. Okay.
Yep, we're in agreement.
I think I don't magical spookies or something inhering in our bodies or something like that. That said, what we're preserving in, and this is going to get to some of the puzzles for me, and I'm curious to see how UTOK addresses them.
And there are serious puzzles. Let's be clear. I read about that in my book, and we can talk about that, and we'll see if we land on the same place on those.
Okay, yeah. Is this idea that there are, so I consider myself to some degree a causal physical functionalist.
Okay.
Which is a metaphysical doctrine in the philosophy of mind.
Yep.
That essentially says that, well, there's a type of functionalist that buys into this notion of supervenience. Okay. Yep. Supervenience is not explanatory. It's just setting a baseline for the kind of naturalism that I espouse.
Yep.
Okay. And it says two things that are identical in all physical respects, and that identity, two beings, let's say Gregg and Gregg's microphysical duplicate, okay, are if they're in all mental physical respects the same, then the mental lives of those two, Gregg 1 and Gregg 2, will be the same, will not differ.
Yep.
Okay. Now, the reverse may not be true. And the reason the reverse may not be true under functionalism is that we can imagine the carbon-based life form is instantiated by, let's say, silicon. Right. But all those causal physical processes are preserved. Now, some people are going to come on and say, oh, that's just reductionist. That sounds like physicalist reductionism. It's like, no, because causation, at least in my metaphysics, is where the action is. Yep. Because you got to have some kind of instantiation medium for giving rise to these subjective states.
Totally.
So that's to me vitally important, and I'm glad you're shaking your head that we agree on that as a minimum sort of a baseline.
Close, we're in very close, tight relation here. I don't know if there's much disagreement at all so far.
And there's also the so-called mental physical dependency thesis, which is very closely adjacent to supervenience. And that says that the mental depends on the physical for its existence. Yep. I agree with that. I can't imagine a world in which the mental didn't depend on the physical for existence, because to exist in my ontology is to exert, is to be causal or have the potential for being causal. Yep. Whatever the mechanism that activates causation, whether that's some prior state, or if you want to get into very strange metaphysics, the virtual, and this is Bard stuff, and this is theoretical physics where you start to get over my head, I don't get it, and I'm not prepared to embrace that as a part of an explanation for the hard problem. Okay,
I'm with you.
It's just, it's interesting, and I want to know more, but I'm not ready to have it bridge the gap.
Good.
And so I can stop there, but suffice it to say, we have now, if I understand and I take it from your behavior, which is what, number one, mind one?
Right. This is my minded behavior, and my mind 3B is hey, yes, Max. Propositionally, I think we're there. If there's a hair's difference, I'm still looking for it.
We're in the ballpark. We're in the ballpark.
We're definitely in the ballpark. Yep.
So we want to keep those mysteries, what I call those mysteries, in that ballpark.
Totally.
And if they leave the ballpark, there may be interesting reasons why they do, but I don't know what they are yet, and that will be
Totally. So
Maybe
yeah,
turn up through
all
the
that's
conversation.
Indo-naturalism. That's all. The all of that is within the arena. The way UTOK descriptive metaphysics operates and what it's concerned with is getting this arena as clear as possible. And if you leave the arena, the world is so different. That world turns out to be so different. Then I think UTOK would have fascinating things to say, but it gets a lot of its power by cleaning up this arena.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I find so lovely about it. And when for example, and I don't mean to divert too much to sort of inside baseball stuff, but the conversation you and I are having on the intellectual deep web you mentioned is one in where we're sussing out, trying to figure out whether and to what extent we're talking in the same arena.
Exactly.
And we find increasingly that we are, so we isolate the problems.
Exactly.
And that's sort of where we are now. So I want to stop there and invite you to jump in, and then we can talk about the mystery some more.
Totally. Yeah. So this is exactly right. And we could say, so somebody, I did a whole UTOKing with Bernardo Kastrup. I don't know if you followed him at all, but he's got a sort of analytic idealism. And then, his big mind or the universe is all mental and all of that. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but basically it starts to move the arena in a way that's hard for me to grasp and at least make full coherent sense out of. So we're just locking our arena here and yes, inside the dimension of mindedness in the language of UTOK, that is the animal dimension of existence with brains and active bodies, then something happens with the normal neurobiological process of information processing in a functionalist sort of way that coalesces ultimately to give rise to this qualitative phenomenological experience of being somewhere along the lines of the animal kingdom. And that the mechanism of this, so this is where then maybe I'll jump in and say, well, this is where the fucking problem is from a UTOK perspective, and see if there should be identifiable physical into chemical biological structure notions that clarify why there is a binding coalescence of experience, okay, of a particular quality. Like, so that you would then say, well, oh, this is how it is that the nervous system and the processes by which the nervous system give rise to the felt sense of subjectivity. What my read is, and I think this is pretty standard, we have a lot of neurocognitive correlates of that, but neurocognitive causation of what gives rise to this experience of vision and why, relative to the experience of olfaction and why, and exactly how that manifests itself, what I would call the neurobiological binding problem, engineering binding problem, that there are really interesting questions there that are quite mysterious.
Yes. Can I try to reflect that back to you to make sure not only that I get it, but that the audience does? Yep. And you stop me if I'm screwing it up.
Good.
Yep. Okay. So because this really helps us. First, we need to be able to parse the distinction, at least in metaphysics, and presumably also in your favorite discipline, two different types of properties.
Right.
Okay. So there are a series of properties that we're going to, because remember, I've been singing the praises of the causal this whole time, and I think you have too. I saw you nodding your head. Causation being where the action is in the universe. Ontology, to exist is to exert in my ontology. That's where the action is, right? Now, it seems intuitively not only plausible, but but it seems right, particularly when we think of qualitative states in mind too, as having evolved through millions of years of iteration cycles to give us these qualitative states, including echidnas and all manner of other creatures that feel pain, pleasure, redness, echolocation, and so on, right? But echolocation, okay, so let's take a person, because let's take a familiar story. Okay. And I want to divide the story into two different sets of properties. And this really gets to the heart, at least in part, of the mind-body problem. One set of properties is a causal physical story. Let's call it the bacon story. And this is the story of you getting up in the morning and grabbing a piece of bacon. If you're a vegan, I apologize. If you're Jewish,
I'm not.
Orthodox Jew, I apologize.
I'm a heritage Jew that eats bacon, so we're good.
Okay, excellent. So you get up in the morning, you smell that bacon, someone's lovingly prepared for you. There is a causal, and then you reach for that bacon and you eat it. There's an entire causal story there that's very complicated, but to some degree linear. There are some nonlinear dynamics going on in our brains and bodies, but that causal story, if we were to trace it fully, is relatively linear, at least unless we want to think of moment to moment bizarre subphysics or what one might call anyway, I don't want to get off on that rabbit trail.
Right. No, we're
kind of bizarre metaphysics that is about theories of the virtual being born into the actual via the present. That's some stuff that it's over my head. I'm getting there, but but let's just say we're trying to distinguish between two different causal stories that we can call properties. We're not committing to the idea of a dualistic universe a la Descartes.
Right.
Okay. We are both sharing this metaphysical commitments of a natural universe that is complete and monistic. But we also know that there are two different sets of properties, one of which can be described in the language of science. So, for example, molecules, let's call them bacony molecules, float up into my nose, strike my mucous membrane, send excitations back to my olfactory cortex in the brain, which does a little dance here through neuronal firings, and finally to my motor cortex. I might also have something in a verbal region in my brain such that I have the thought that says, ooh, man, I do want some bacon. But otherwise, it generates that minded behavior of grabbing.
Totally.
Okay? Now, that is a complete causal story, or so it would seem. Okay? But we have this other story that there was something it was like for me to experience this causal. Let's just divorce it from the causal physical process. The science story. There was something it was like for me to experience this. And it was that experience that prompted me, that caused me, to grab the bacon, where we terminate the two stories in the grabbing behavior.
Love it.
Okay. So now I'm thinking, gosh, we got ourselves the horns of a dilemma.
We go. And this is right. This is where, lovely.
Yeah. Okay. And it's like, okay, one horn of that dilemma is that the phenomenal states that are so profound, that's like that smelliness thing that happened to me that made me want to grab the behavior. That was what caused me to grab the behavior. I mean, the grabbing behavior. Or there was this causal physical process that we can describe in sophisticated neurophysiological terms that also caused me to grab the bacon.
Right.
If both of those things are causally efficacious, if both of those stories are causally efficacious, then we have a strange problem. And that would be one that would commit us to a strange metaphysics, a metaphysics of what is known as causal overdetermination. That means each of those stories was 100% responsible for that grabbing behavior. That means 200%. We're living in a world of 200% causal efficacy.
Right. When we get this mind too, it's a whole nother layer of causal efficacy that screws us up metaphysically.
That's right. That's right. It's like, well, holy shit. Well, let's just get rid of that and say that the phenomenal state, that the stuff that felt like It was something it was like to experience it that prompted it.
Right.
Just like the experience of the orgasm that prompted me to, get my spouse pregnant, is not really the causal story. That's just an epiphenomenon. Right. It hangs out in a causally, it is caused, but does not cause. It does not engage in what is known metaphysically as downward causation.
Yep.
Where downward causation would be causal overdetermination, 100%, 100%.
Totally.
But if we do that, we're saying there is no reason whatsoever for us to have evolved this because it's causally useless. Because evolution deals in causation. So then we say, okay, fine. It's not causally overdetermined. Then that means it's either useless, an epiphenomenon, or it's causally overdetermined. So if I go back and forth in between these two possible metaphysical outcomes, I'm left with this dilemma. I have to accept either causal overdetermination, which is weird, and I don't get why, or I'm left with this idea that our phenomenal states are just epiphenomena and evolution gave them to us on accident. But we could just as well be zombies or like more sophisticated tropistic creatures.
Yep.
And the person I'm talking to on the other side of this screen down in Brazil is actually a zombie, and I'm the only one with these magical phenomenal states, for example, right?
For example, right.
So that's one of the mysteries that for me is very challenging and difficult, and I don't have an answer for it.
Great. Yeah.
And I'm curious if UTOK does.
Well, I mean, I think UTOK has some important things to say about it, but it is absolutely the case that this is going to, for me, this gets all tangled up with the whole binding problem I was talking about. There's an engineering problem that says, are we really causally clear on animal behavior through this? Do we really have the whole picture? We can certainly say that there's a neurocognitive functional. So here, I'll give the language. So the Mind 1A stuff corresponds to what David Chalmers calls the easy problems, and we'll call those the neurocognitive functional view, which basically it's a set of input, output, hierarchical structures, and we can follow the trail of input output in a recursion from a third person perspective and say, oh, that input output function makes sense. Okay, we'll call it the low road of the neurobiological structure. And then there's this other thing, this Mind 2 domain, okay, that sits. And it's like, well, where does that fall in this picture? Okay, and how? And my answer basically is that's in the animal kingdom in particular, we are getting better at making claims about which animals, like I would say with a lot of confidence right now through the neurocognitive correlate data, dogs have this mind too. Okay, and we can do that by looking at what mammals do, and we can look at the correlates and say there is certain kinds of behavioral neurocognitive activity that is strongly correlated with this. If you haven't read it, Consciousness and the Brain by Stefanos Dehane, sorry if I botch his name, but that's a great book. This is in humans mostly, but it's on the global neuronal workspace. He pulls off Bernard Barr's global workspace theory is a good model for this. It doesn't solve this, but I think it tightens some of the area of analysis, at least from its perspective. So for example, in that, when we look at humans, and then this generalizes to other animals, there's a tight correlation within that paradigm, and I think it generalized. Like when you experiencing something, when you open your eyes and you say, oh, there's a cup, it takes about 0.3 of a second for a set of activity between your frontal and parietal lobe, what they call an ignition switch, a P300 ignition switch, 300 for 300 milliseconds, that corresponds tightly with the subjective experience of that. Okay, because if you do it in terms of like subliminal, you don't see it and then you see it. Well, when you see it, it's very tightly associated with an ignition switch between your frontal lobe and your parietal lobe. And what's coming online then is a holding broadcast function. That's what the global neuronal workspace, global. There's a tightening of some information that then gets bound together and then serves as a central broadcast point. Now, that's happening in parallel to a lot of other shit that's happening, what I would call the base non-mind to neurocognitive functionalism stuff that would enable you to grab a drink potentially and never have subconscious awareness, never have the subjective experience of it at all. So one way of thinking about it is there definitely does seem to be sort of a recursive higher order cluster that takes, at least in humans, is cortical based in many ways. There's a lot of debate about where this would happen, et cetera. But you can start to pair
that.
That
Reminds me, by the way, of selective attention, right? Where it's not always the case. There has to be, I guess you would call it a filtration mechanism for relevance for all of this data coming in. If you want to look at it as purely information processing, and your phenomenal consciousness, it seems to be some relationship between that, the relevance of all that data to some future behavior.
Totally.
In the likelihood, whether it's, I guess you could call it probabilistic or Bayesian likelihood, that behavior is going to be good for you as a being, as a human being. And otherwise, there's this other process, and this is where you shine. I'm sure you guys shine. The selective attention is another additional mechanism for where you have a directed, an almost agentic shining the spotlight on these different qualia.
Totally.
Because you're constantly being besieged by qualia, but they're not all relevant.
That's right. So to bring something onto the stage of attention requires both top down and bottom up intersection. So a bottom up refers to the strength of the stimuli relative to expectation coming into you. So if the state of the stimuli is predicted based on what it is, you basically don't pay much attention and you're on. If it surprises you, so you all of a sudden, I hear something that I don't really surprise you, pulls your attention to it. Likewise, if I say pay attention to your big toe right now and press down on it, okay, you can then pull down, that big toe is there. You can take the filter, the mind's eye, find where the relevant incoming is and do a top-down, bottom-up relation. To see the top-down, bottom-up, there's a great illusion I like to point people to, the duck-rabbit illusion you may have seen, where on one level you look at it, it's a duck, and another, and it will flip back and forth. Well, what's happening there is your schema, sense-making for, the hypothesis is that's a duck, meaning not your justificatory hypothesis, your perceptual hypothesis, says it's a duck, it will map it, and then you get duck-related activation of meaning. Then it flips over to a rabbit, and the cool experience as you go back and forth, can you hold them at the same time, etc. So the attentional structure is this relevance framing. John and I talk quite a bit about this. This can be directed consciously. In fact, this is, if you have the experience of free will, it is this felt sense of, hey, Max, I can decide to think of you, and I can decide to think of Bard, and I can decide to think of Marcia. Can I move my attention around anywhere I want? Right? Now, that's a whole other.
Unless you're sitting on a hot burner, in which case.
Well, then, right. Actually, I often talk about that, too. If the bottom up is so direct, like a torturer's chair, you will pay attention to the torturer. There ain't no way I'm thinking about Marcia. If somebody's bending my fingers backwards with pliers, that is what I will tend to. It will be captured unless maybe you have some unbelievable mindfulness capacities that people train that attentional mechanism. So yes, there's a selective attention. This actually brings up one, I think, very important point about the nature of consciousness, John and I talk a lot about, is that it's a recursive stack at some level. Like we have to be able to, we're bringing recursivity and stacking through different layers of processing. But to go all the way back, let me just make a comment. So there's a bit of a mystery, but I will say that we can, what I would say is what's happening with the Mind 2 is a integrating broadcast functioning that in many ways is running in parallel with Mind 1. It's recursively operating on it, and it's a working memory checkpoint. Okay, so there is a lot of causal stuff that can be released, regulated, operated on without mind two getting involved on the one hand. Okay, but I would say that there's a lot of things that do require mind two. Where in the animal kingdom mind two emerges, that's a great question. We talk a little bit about, why that's so confusing, although why I think things like dogs, we have broken that so that you'd have to say, yeah, based on the data, we have enough neurocognitive correlates to the kinds of things that are associated with mind two in us that almost certainly are present in dogs, whether they're present in fish or flies. Those are great questions. I mean, agnostic. I lean toward yes, but there are the good reasons to be suspicious. However, you made a very important point, which maybe we could touch upon also at some point, either right now or later, is this issue about humans. Okay. Now, humans, could I be a zombie? Okay. Is that possible? To me, I'm skeptical of the zombie idea, although I get the concept of it, of course. It's not hard to say, well, in theory, somebody could. The zombie idea does get confusing because when I say to you, hey, Max, right before that, I had a nice ice cold Coke and I let it sit in my throat for a little while, right? And I felt all of that little tingy, and that reminded me of when I was a kid. And I was just enjoying that experience, right? So if I talk to you about my inexperience, something very different is the case with a zombie who cannot possibly recursively reflect on that experience.
He can.
Well, okay. That now here we have to get in it. We can dialogue about whether or not.
Yeah.
This is, to me, an interesting debate about the whole philosophical zombie issue in the relationship to, if you subtract out mind two, is the zombie really the same? The zombie behaves the same at the level of mind 1B and mind 3B, but the line creates some real interesting philosophical confusions. He says that, okay, but saying that and being that aren't necessarily the same thing. That raises a bunch of different questions. So anyway, the bottom line is that I think we just threw probably too many threads out there. See if you want to pick up on any.
Imagine it's one way to look at the possibility of zombies is I think you sent me the article the other day about imagining a future AI that really does a good job of passing the Turing test, and that maybe it's hooked up to sensors, cameras, or something like that, and maybe it doesn't look terribly human, but we can imagine a humanoid, robot that talks about its experiences, talks about, that's, my orgasm was amazing. I shouldn't use orgasm because I don't want to sexualize everything, but that's one of the most intense qualitative states that are very memorable for people. But the taste of something. Also, we can appeal to the old Thomas Nagel's bat and imagine that we could hear with a level of high resolution that a bat can. We can imagine that, at least, even though we don't. If you imagine that you could see with your ears, that's how high res it is for a bat to be able to hear with echolocation. They can make out structures in the room, a moth, as you like. Now, the qualitative state is going to be different from vision, we assume, because we're mapping that. We're sort of creating an analog to our own hearing, and just imagine our own hearing being higher resolution. But it gives us an idea about these different sets of properties.
Yeah.
And once we really unpack and distinguish, and I think compartmentalize those two different sets of properties, which you are perfectly willing to do in UTOK, then we have to think about what it means for those properties to be causal or non-causal. And if they're non-causal, I go back to the question, why are they there? Zombies are meant to unpack that if you take out causation as a condition for it, then you're just saying that there's something caused. Then we can start to talk about stuff like in zombies or inverted spectra. Are you
Sure.
familiar with inverted spectra?
Yeah, if you want to share a little bit about that.
Sure. Okay.
Not everyone will be.
So
Yes,
that goes back to kids. Kids talk about, say, hey, I see this red apple, but I bet you can't prove to me that this doesn't look green to you and it looks red to me, but we both call it red. Right? That would be an example of an inverted spectrum.
Yep.
Now there's some, science peculiarities with wavelengths and so on that might logically preclude certain kinds of things. But at the end of the day, we don't know if that quail being the singular of qualia,
Yep.
redness 156, is present in my experience as it is yours.
Yep.
There's no way to prove it. There's nothing in science. We can sort of imagine that it probably is. We can hope for the best. We can say, science gets us in the direction with our understanding of wavelengths and so on, and striking the optic nerve and all this and that. But just like in the classic Mary story, you can
the colorblind.
You learn something new in the story of Mary when Mary opens the door and sees the Macintosh apple for the first time, experiences it, despite all of her knowledge of everything neurophysical, neurochemical, and causal. And that going back to Gilbert Ryle, where we're asking, where's the pain? I can't cut open my arm and find the pain. We're talking about these neurophysical correlates to these qualitative states. But what really gets interesting is when because I'm, again, a committed physicalist, but it is extremely counterintuitive for me to think that if my qualitative states aren't causally efficacious, why I have them. That is a mystery. Now, when I take your view, which is that it's something involved, it's an interface, it is it's situated between 1, A and B, and 3, and provides this interface that allows us to make certain kind of best guesses from an agentic standpoint as far as how we interact with the world. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of interface, a model, a representational schema.
Yep.
That all sounds great to me from a cognitive science standpoint. But when we flip that around to metaphysics, I find it utterly perplexing. Do you see why?
Yeah. I do see why. I think that if we were able to me, again, I think this is the other side of the coin of the neurobiological binding problem. If we were to identify the binding, let's say there is this global structure that is basically running in parallel, but there's a causal, efficacious, and a feedback loop structure. And then if we understood the nature of that binding, we understood how to break it, and then we understood it, and then saw the behavioral consequence, I think you'd be, here is causally how it's essentially running in parallel and why, and then this is how it's essentially, sort of one way to think about it is it's like it's running just behind the scenes, checking things. Okay, so a lot could happen without it, but especially for us humans, whereby the nature of mind 3 is that it requires a lot of mind 2, at least in the everyday world. Right. In other words, you go through the world and you're like, hey, how did you feel about that? You require then the introspection on mind 2. Mind 2 then basically organize the basic model representation of internal states and report, this is why I did this and this is what's going on with me. I would argue an enormous amount of that is essentially kind of everyday confabulation. Confabulation meaning you generate a narrative about what the hell's going on. When we psychologists break your narratives down, whether it's the Freudian version of this or the social psychology version of this, we know that a lot of that introspective awareness is essentially just, stitching together kind of background cognitive dissonance reduction to give a justifiable narrative of what's going on when from a reason perspective. So one of the things I would say as a psychologist is there's a lot of causal shit that's happening independent of that mind too. For sure. So we know there's
mind 2 itself causal.
Well, I would say mind 2 definitely has a physical instantiation and is creating. It's an epistemic integration element that if you break, it will have causal impact. Absolutely. So I think we're missing some ingredients that afford clarity about the physical instantiation of what the broadcast function is, which I call the neurobiological binding mystery problem. So I don't think we have a full causal understanding. Okay, it depends on what you mean by a full causal understanding, right? You're like, I mean, we kind of have an understanding, but the idea that we have a full understanding of all of the processes that are actually required to manifest that would be a bit of a stretch.
And this is sort of like why. So this goes back to let's just imagine that you're right, that all of these processes, these minds, minds 1, 2, and 3, fit together and process something recursively. And that is a complex causal process. The mapping of which is going to take some future neuroscience, and you guys will be at the forefront of it. When you take that set of questions, however, that mapping is not going to tell us whether and to what extent those specific properties of qualia are causally efficacious. It's only going to tell us that there's something in mind too that is causal, and you and I agree that it's causal, however complicated, however complex. And we can make that distinction as well separately. But let's just say complex. That the properties of what it's like, the phenomenal properties, are not themselves causal.
Okay.
Because if they are, we have to go back then to downward causation, causal overdetermination.
Right. All right. Let's throw in another variable here for just a second. Well, let's throw in the epistemological variable. Okay. So the epistemological variable is, well, how are we saying, well, what's our causal understanding? I would argue, well, we're pretty much going to science. Okay. And science then develops as a particular kind of justification system. All right, that says, hey, we're going to understand the world. This is the case I make in the book. We're going to understand the world behaviorally. In other words, the set of metaphysical propositions there are entities, there are fields, and there's an unfolding wave of causation that I'm going to try to map with precision and logic, experimentation and measurement. And then I'm going to develop a language game in relationship to that tries to make predictions, eliminate alternative explanations. Sometimes we're pretty fucking successful at that, sometimes not so much, but it tells it's a particular kind of justification, okay? It is a justification system, I would argue. If you look at primary versus secondary, back in the Humean, Lockean days, if we do philosophically, there is certainly something very interesting that's happening with the language game of science and the way it describes cause in the world, okay? Through a behavioral perspective that makes subjectivity, the first-person qualitative experience of being, interesting, right? At an epistemological level. Like there are aspects by which the language game of science, okay, I will argue, structures itself behaviorally to be, well, not play very nice with qualia at multiple levels or subjectivity or the first-person experience of being in the world. So one of the things I want to bring here, just to add, so for me, the way I'm making sense of it is I think there's a binding mechanism that we don't understand, okay? If we understood that, I think that would solve a number of the issues that you're raising. But we don't. I would say I don't. I call that the hard problem of mind two, okay, in relation. I also want to highlight that the nature of scientific explanation and its epistemology is quite different in many ways defined whereas mind two is essentially constituted by an interior, inside-out epistemological vector. The language of science is an exterior, outside-in epistemological vector. And that's very important, I think, in terms of why we might find some of at least these confusions. What do you think of that?
Well, certainly, I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, maybe I'm not. I mean, this is also the reason why some of the people who call themselves causal physical functionalists like me, when they commit to that sort of metaphysics, they're accused of being neo-behaviorists. They're saying you're completely disqualifying this whole other world because you're only talking under the in this language scheme, and your metaphysical commitments are only in this language frame. Remember, I said I don't want to commit to something that is extra causal and nevertheless efficacious in the universe. That would, because that to me leads us back to Cartesian dualism. And yet I know that, and Daniel Dennett refers to it sort of disparagingly as the Cartesian theater, but the Cartesian theater is there. It is every aspect of our waking lives. My mind too is it's phenomenal turtles all the way down. Even when we're doing science, right? We have to count on this, which it's complete faith. And this goes back to, this is, the Humean aspect of this is that we're making all sorts of inferences about that which is outside of our phenomenal realm.
Right.
Tables and chairs and maxes and this and that, right? Because all that is available to us in these classic philosophical problems are phenomena.
Right.
But you and I agreed that, so yeah, we're going to go ahead and commit to a metaphysics of tables and chairs, and indeed of causation. We're not going to embrace this guy, I forgot his name, his idealism.
Bernardo Castro.
Right, an updated idealism. Bishop Berkeley being, and
Sure.
this is idealism is an interesting theory.
Oh, it's absolutely interesting.
Gets us to stuff like what is it called? Simulation theory and stuff like this. The idea that the whole universe is ideas in the mind of God is Berkeley's version. Simulation theory, that is, it's some kind of advanced instantiation of information available to a subject. Now, how that subject comes to be and how it gets instantiated is not clearly answered in the simulation theory that I've had contact with, but that takes us too far afield. I do, however, think that there's something to this idea of primary and secondary qualities that pushes us toward the mysteries of mind-body problem. And that is with, it's been years, you'll have to forgive me, but I think primary and secondary qualities under Locke, the red that your experience is that the primary?
It's two. That's second. No,
secondary
the way that primary is what exists potentially separate from us. Secondary is what we are imputing upon it. So the redness versus the wavelength. Wavelength would be the primary, although we didn't have wavelengths back then. But
yeah. So and you can see from my mistake how easy it is to invert because of the power of the phenomenal in our lives.
Totally.
So if we ask our students to find the redness in a wavelength, especially if we accelerate if we're a fixed point and we accelerate that wavelength relative to us, it's not even going to be red, it's going to be blue because of Doppler effects.
Yeah.
So it's like there's something going on in our minds that doesn't adhere in the world, even though we're committed to that world existing and it being monistic and connected to us. That phenomenal state that's operating within us is not something that we're going to be able to go out and find in the world. So what is the nature of that thing in us? And that goes back to the classical philosophy of mind problem. What is the nature of that ontological nature of that experience? And that remains a mystery to me. So the nature of that thing, what is the mechanism by which it arises? Is it causal? And if not, why is it there? And yet it is the sum of our waking lives. And finally, how do I know yours and mine are sufficiently similar to be connected to the causal nexus of reality in a predictive or nomic way?
Lovely. Yep. Great. Yeah, I mean, so for UTOK embraces all of that in the sense that, yes, those are great questions. Those are interesting. UTOK brings its new vocabulary. It says, actually, it's important we call this consciousness is a really complicated world. Mind two emerging out of mind one, because then you'd have all these other, you can certainly do functional analysis, but let's stay within at least if this is what we're talking about, let's stay within this. Let's connect it also to mind three. So that's helpful. What is the nature of that remains, at a mechanical build it level. Like, do we know how to build something that feels this either in cells or in other kinds of things? That's a really, not now. We don't know how to do that, I would argue. Yeah. We don't know how to build something that's sentient. So we don't know the underlying engineering of it. The question about where does it come online and what makes it necessary is really, really key to understand, certainly at the human level. Okay, and I would also argue really sort of basically it really is going to tie to issues of surprise and working memory at a basic level, meaning that essentially when you have to hold something, integrate it, manipulate it, and make decisions, this is going to run a higher order representational stimuli. This is what John and I talked about in the Untangling the World Knot. At a cognitive and phenomenological and then recursive relevance realization level, there's an extension, an opening, and a simulator that's running and broadcasting on top of the initial loop. So it's a higher order recursive. So if you think about just the sensory motor loop as mind one, at some level, there's an emerging recursive loop that is binding epistemically, meaning that it's pulling information together, creating an informational whole that allows for the coordination of the whole. And that's one of the things about emergence is that when you get informational wholes, they can't be reduced to their parts. Okay, so like you see me, your information system looks over and sees me as Gregg. I'm a collection of all these tiny little parts. But you pull the epistemic information of what Gregg is, treat me as Gregg in your epistemic framing, and that has causal applications for you as a representation, as a holistic that then is irrelevant relative to me. And that's just a good example about how higher order representational phenomenon have causal impact that's not reducible to its parts in the physicalist sense, even though we're in a one world naturalism, clearly. The informational properties of structures have these powers in particular. And so I would argue the neuroinformation. And then there's this interesting mind to binding structure. Where it emerges in the animal kingdom is a mystery that tells you how much we don't know about it. In humans, however, with the questions of mind three, hey, Max, tell me about how you thought about coming into this. What do you think about bar and so forth? Now, all of a sudden, mind three gives access to mind two. Now you check in your working memory, your epistemic memory story. You have to pull up and then have a stage, your Cartesian theater, to report to me what it is that you're carrying around with you. So we humans have this as a major aspect of our life. Other animals, it's more interesting, and although I certainly think that humans were not the reason mind two evolved, I think it happens way before us. But I think mind three shapes mind two in us in a very interesting way.
Let me, if you don't mind, and I know we're running out of time, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
I'd love to.
But I'd like to ask you a question about something that I encountered in your work that I'm curious about, that may lead us to unpack a little more of these questions about mind two.
Right.
And that is the suggestion of what you termed, and I think you were talking to John Vervaeke about this, the adverbial and adjectival aspects of phenomenal consciousness or qualia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and the other thing I need to mention is the iQuad coin. So those are two things at least I want to touch on. Maybe we'll figure out that is crucial to UTOK. So when we're understanding this emerged, John and I realized that when we put our systems together, you get a lot of functionalism and phenomenological stuff that really works well. That's really cool, both meta theories. He had developed a distinction for mind two that was adjectival versus adverbial qualia. In terms of when we look at the binding, adverbial refers to the framing effect of here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness. So this is the phenomenology of binding, okay? And you can sort of see it in its purest form when you hear meditators talk about dropping into a pure consciousness state, okay? Whereby they're not really conscious of anything, even its consciousness itself. They just have the binding presence of awareness, but it's just that. That's what they call it, a pure consciousness state. So that would be sort of a way to peel back all the layers and leave behind in the adverbial binding of here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness. Now, normally what happens is that you have a felt sense of the here-ness, now-ness, togetherness binds to orient you toward what we would, to qualia, the normal term of qualia, which we just called adjectival qualia. That's redness. Hey, that's a tape, at higher order conceptual levels. Oh, there's masking tape right there. I open my eyes and see that. That's a set of properties that I can then grip and tell you, oh, that's the functional form of that thing. We can narrow that down to quail. What's the smallest little thing? I feel orange right here. And then we can open that up to perceptual forms. So those are adjectival. We also said that quickly infused in that will also be valence qualia. That's pleasure and pain. So at the minimum, as far as us animal consciousness, it seems to bind together the here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness, giving rise to a broadcast function, at least according to global normal workspace. It orients us to see the properties, and it gives us valence qualia, good or bad. And even though if you're not conscious of it, actually, you get a lot of flicker. So that's a way to describe functionally aspects of mind too, in a way that I think is helpful.
Gotcha. Okay. And on the first one, I need to sit with the idea of it being adverbial in the sense of here-ness, now-ness, and so on. But it's the valence qualia is one that's going to prompt you to do something.
Yeah. It's going to plug you in. You have two broad affect systems: approach good, avoid bad, and we're constantly checking across a lot of different recursivity. That's good, that's bad, and then approach that, hold on to that, get rid of that, avoid that. And so the valence is a marker, basically, which is
trying to add the ly to things to imagine. The other is just more situating oneself, one's agglomeration of selves, if you like. In some context.
Yeah, exactly. Let me, I'll actually give you a phenomenological experience of this. So I'm in Brazil. You can order mushrooms online in Brazil, okay? So we did that when I was here before. And I had a really peak, beautiful experience with it, okay? And the idea was this here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness is like I hired mushrooms that were like composers of beauty. They stacked my consciousness together in a here-ness, now-ness, togetherness that also gave rise to enormous amount of color and richness. And it was an unbelievably moving experience, okay? Well, I was like, I want that again, and then I did it again, and it almost had the reverse effect. Okay, that is like I was told by more experience. I did psychedelics when I was a young man in the 20s, and I hadn't done them for a long time, but all of a sudden they're available here. We did them, and I was a little casual about it, so I did quite a bit, and it was great the first time, and then I had this expectation. I was like, well, I'm going to ride this psychedelic horse. I was like, well, anybody that really knows psychedelics is like, you don't decide where it's going to go. As soon as you put that down and you say, I want to get back to that beauty mountain, it's done with you. And essentially that happened. So I'm starting up the beauty mountain, and then all of a sudden, my system basically, my eyes go fuzzy, and it breaks, and I go very confused. Okay. And essentially what happened, one way I described it was, that adverbial qualia was orchestrated beautifully, as if I had, I had a Bach composer of mushrooms in me. And then I had a bunch of jokers or people playing totally different music. So I couldn't even bring a coherent here-ness, now-ness together of everyday perception. My eyes were blurry. I was confused I'd start to do something. I would feel, am I normal now? Am I not normal now? So I had about an hour and a half, a real broken framing. Between that, the fun house. Yeah, exactly. Mirror fun house that is just not right in terms of its coreness. So at the phenomenological level, we can then say whether that was because of my top-down interacting, whether there were different, there's a virus in those mushrooms or the second one, or whatever. At a level, I could certainly say, hey, from the inside-out phenomenological view, and then there have to be an outside-in, also different coordination of my nervous system. So anyway, then that brings me to the last thing I want to say is in UTOK, we have two kind of like Bard's, his logos, pathos, and mythos. UTOK comes with different epistemological frames because I am deeply concerned with what science just is imputes upon us to give us a justification system, which is so powerful. But is it aware of its blind spots? And I am concerned about the subjectivity blind spot. So UTOK brings the tree of knowledge and says, hey, this is the way. If we all zoom back, imagine us ability to watch the universe unfold through a cinema and through our microscopes and telescopes, and then we could all watch this unfolding of cosmic evolution. Then there's a thing called the iQuad coin, which says actually the iQuad coin is your unique, local, particular, subjective, qualitative experience of being in the world. It literally defines itself as the epicenter of secondary qualia. Relative to primary qualia in the old school, and says actually we certainly need, especially if we don't understand the binding problem, we actually need to be jumping back and forth between these two epistemological vantage points and thinking about how to bridge them, rather than just thinking that science tells it the way it is and the rest of it is epiphenomenal. There's a danger of that in the way that science is defining things at first. And so I think you get a lot of mileage in UTOK by jumping from what we call the coin and the tree and learning to marry the coin to the tree, which is basically jumping from the language of science to the language of subject and back.
And you have to do that in psychology. You have to.
Well, right. Part of this is the problem in psychology in terms of it's a clusterfuck because we didn't have the right descriptive, even basic descriptive metaphysics to get the boxes in order on behavior and mental process and emotion and self and consciousness. It's a shit show.
Yeah, I remember you wrote something about, and this is probably tangentially related, but also connected to it, as what I've interpreted, at least, as the enlightenment gap.
Yep. That's what this is all about, right? So I argue that psychology couldn't get defined, and then I got philosophical and ultimately realized, once we developed physics and then epistemologically grounded our justifications in physics, we had this huge mind problem. And the enlightenment gap was we were never able to put ontologically matter in relationship to mind, give rise to all these causal problems, and we just didn't have the right schematic. And we didn't have the right epistemological place of objective knowledge as scientifically defined relative to subjective and social knowledge. UTOK tries to resolve the enlightenment gap partially with the tree of knowledge, and then its coin garden representation to actually hold justification language games for subjectivity and collective wisdom, and argues very much like Bard that actually things are a lot clearer when we realize we're playing different epistemological games or frames. And I don't mean that flippantly. I mean that we need these frames. They're really helpful, but we need to realize where their limits are.
Yeah, I like to think in terms of, it's fun. It's metaphorical, but I like to think of it in terms of casting spells. Because when you access these different dimensions, you're able to, for example, narrative, which, is to some extent mind 3, but it has the ability to create excitations back in mind 2 as you evoke memories. Cartesian theater appears, So these moving in and out of these different minds, as you put them, with different modalities, pathos, logos, mythos, and so on, even ethos. I would add ethos in there.
Me too.
As part of
I do.
cultural.
I could. Actually, I do.
This is what it means to be a great, at least rhetorician and communicator, if not a philosopher and a thinker and a scientist.
Yeah.
Particularly in the human sciences,
right. You need this in the human sciences, in my view. You have to be able to dance through it, or else and figure out some framing on it. And certainly UTOK landed on that framing, and it's actually quite parallel to Bard. It's cool to hear your sharing.
Yeah. So. Well, it's a beautiful theory, and it's really helpful schema.
So,
I'm
I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It helps me get clear and helps me understand your perspective. I really enjoyed the conversation. I do hope we do it again. Let's circle back whenever the movement emerges that'll be productive and fruitful.
I look forward to it.
All right, Max. Thanks so much. Wish you the best. Take care.